Welcome to UNIDU interview. I'm Klara Zuanic. Today we have a guest who needs no introduction if you've ever taken a marketing or research method class. His books are basically the holy grail for anyone working with data, and his work has been cited over 500,000 times, which is just mind-blowing. He's a legend in marketing, research, and multivariate analysis, and we're super excited to have him with us today. Professor Joe here, welcome. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.
Your work has had a massive impact on marketing research and multivariate analysis. What initially drew you to this field, and how has your perspective evolved over the years?
Well, actually, it's interesting when you say what drew me to the field. I was forced into it by some professors who said, you need to learn multivariate data analysis, and I had no choice because I wanted to graduate. I was 3 years into a doctoral program, and when I began reading about it, I had to self-teach myself because I had a deadline. So once I began to learn about it, it became quite interesting because there was a lot of data that was available, and that data could help you make decisions. And once I learned how to execute the software and to analyze the data, it became a lot easier than I initially thought it was going to be.
And now so many people are learning from you, basically.
Well, as a matter of fact, I've been teaching now this particular technique and really all the statistical techniques now for 55 years. And it's been fun. It continues to be fun because the field changes, but what's most interesting about it is the observation of the way that students learn what the data can do for them and help them to understand how they can make better decisions, not only personal decisions, but for those who are working, which is what I work with most of the time, students who are coming to school in order to update their skills. It opens up an entire new vision of what the possibilities are for them in their career, as well as in their own jobs, where they can make decisions better if they base it on data instead of on just, I think this or I think that.
Many students struggle with statistical techniques when conducting research, as you just said. What advice would you give to young researchers trying to navigate complex methodologies?
Well, probably persistence, and I'm sorry, but read my books because the reason that my books have been so successful is I developed a skill early on of how to simplify the concepts that traditionally had been in the textbooks. The early textbooks were communicated in formulas and with X's and Y's and so forth. And those X's and Y's tell a story, but many students are not familiar with how to tie the X's and Y's together to create some result. So what I did is to translate it in my books into, well, not necessarily plain English, but English that was easier to, in fact, understand what's happening. Statistical analysis is basically about what happens in a black box. It's the information you start with, the information that you produce. And statistics is about what you do with the information that you put in and then how you interpret what comes out. So the secret of my success in book writing and in teaching and in research and so forth is the idea that I can understand what's happening in between the input and the output and put it in simple terms. I do have to use some complicated vocabulary, but again, I can express it in a simple way with simple language. One of the other things that I do in my books is that because it's a new vocabulary that you have to, in fact, use to understand the different terminologies. I put the definitions at the beginning of the book so that I say, instead of having to turn to the back or try to understand what it is, if you look at the definitions in the beginning, and when I say definitions, there's some strange terms, or at least even I still think of them as strange. For example, what is heteroskedasticity? I don't expect you to answer. Or what is homoskedasticity, and how does that influence the result? Or what is a non-normalized data, and how does it influence the output? So I put the definitions in the beginning. They can refer to them, and then I reduce it to English and words that they can understand what's happening in a common sense way.
Your book on multivariate data analysis has been a must-read for decades. How do you see the role of advanced analytics evolving in marketing research?
Well, advanced analytics is really just some additional tools. The traditional analytics that we were teaching, or the traditional statistics that we were teaching that we referred to as multivariate data analysis, involved some assumptions about the data. And those assumptions were that some of your data is independent or predictor variables, and the rest of it is dependent, that you're trying to understand with the knowledge that you have of independent variables. And so you start with traditional statistics, the multivariate data analysis. You start with your logic, or you start with some theory, and then you test that theory. With analytics, you start with the data and you say, where are the patterns in the data, and how can I use those patterns that I identify? So with the analytics side, you don't necessarily start with independent and dependent variables. You start with, say, dive down into the data and see where I can find something, and then I back into it, or you teach students to back into it and say, what's the meaning of that pattern, and how can I use that in terms of solving my business problems? It turns out also that I have built upon my multivariate data analysis, and in another year or so, I'm working on it now. I'm going to come out with a business analytics book, because there are some techniques that enable you to understand the data from a business analytics perspective that you can't necessarily do, or that are more difficult to do by starting on the front end and just looking at the statistical side of it. It's all about identifying patterns in the data that are not easy to identify without applying a type of correlation or machine learning that basically it's like a snake going through all these data piles, and all of a sudden it emerges. And when it emerges, then you begin to have to put some kind of meaning to it. So instead of starting with independent and dependent variables, you start with data and you start with patterns, and you apply some correlational analysis and differences, and some patterns emerge that help you to understand and ultimately to make better decisions, just as it has, as we've done now for the last 50 or 60 years. So they're just different tools, but tools that are applied to information that increasingly is being created in society, and they just help us make sense of that data so that we can continue to make the best decisions possible and continue to be competitive in an increasingly complex world.
Hearing all this, how long does it take you usually to write one book?
Well, first off, I almost always have co-authors, because I don't know everything. I know a lot, and I know the approach about books. So what I typically did early is to find co-authors who were already, they were friends of mine and colleagues at the university. And so I wrote with those colleagues that I knew that had the skills and had the commitment and the persistence to be able to work on something and ultimately finish it. Today, I work with many of my students who also want to learn how to write books. And in terms of writing books, you asked me how long. With a team of 2 or 3 people that I can work with, at most, it'll take two years to write something. So I start the process out where we outline what topics need to be in the book. And then I assign to each of the individuals in terms of what skills they have to write various chapters. And they send me the chapters that they write the drafts on. And having published over, I think recently, 150 editions of my books that I've written in the last 50 years, I go back and rewrite it in simple terms so that it's clear and that what I would call the mass market or a large group of people, it's in an understandable language where they can explain what's happening. I send it back to them and they revise the way according to how I suggest to it, and then I get it again. And so I work with young authors today to write books, but I teach them the skills that I've learned. And I wrote my marketing analytics book, which we wrote, 3 years ago, because we're already in the second edition of the marketing analytics book. We wrote that in about 20 months. And then we wrote the sales analytics book, which is forthcoming in the next 2 or 3 months. And we wrote that in a year. Now, the sales book is a little shorter, so that's the reason we could write it in a year. But the key to writing books is to understand what it takes in terms of the tools you need and the knowledge that you need. But then it takes people who are willing to dedicate the time to it, and that you can help them to produce something that will be understandable by people who are not experts or technical people in terms of it. And then you can sell not just to the limited number of people that understand equations, you can sell to a broad group of people who need these tools, but they don't have the support materials, and they don't have the ability to extract from other books that are more technical how to write it. So what I would say is the business analytics book is going to take a year and a half, 18 months. But actually, I went to the publisher and I was able to get a contract. We proposed a contract with them for a graduate level book. And after we shared our ideas with them, what they asked us to do is to sign a contract for both an undergraduate and a graduate. So it's going to take us probably 2.5 years. And we're going to write the graduate one, and then we're going to adapt the graduate book to the undergraduate book. So in another 2.5 years, we'll have 2 more books.
Well, while we are still on the subject of students, you worked extensively with PhD students and young scholars. What are the biggest mistakes you see students making in their research?
Well, I try to help them to avoid mistakes. I think that the big mistakes, or some of the big mistakes that they might make, is first off, in terms of understanding what kind of commitment it takes to do this, and also being persistent, because if you work a day here and you take off for a day there, then start again, you have to build up again. So when you want to be successful as a book author and producing a book, it's setting aside time and consistently working on it. And the one key that I tell students in terms of, or even young faculty member in terms of working on your books or working on your articles, is if you have 10 minutes, write a paragraph. Okay, the 10-minute rule. If you have 10 minutes, write a paragraph, because that's one paragraph you've written. It may not be a good paragraph or an acceptable one, but it gets your ideas down on paper. So during your day, in terms of time management, manage your time, work on it consistently, and then recognize that short periods of time can help you to create something that is useful and meaningful. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be the final product. But once you put it down on paper, that's an idea that you don't forget. And if you put together a bunch of 10-minute kind of, or 15-minute or a half an hour or whatever, then in fact, eventually you have a chapter, and then you take the chapter. So the biggest mistake they make is the fact that during the day or during the week or something, they have opportunities to create little components that, when you combine those components together, end up being something good, but they waste their time if they say, I've only got 10 minutes or a half an hour. It's not that I work all the time, but you need to consistently devote yourself to something, because if you get away from it for too long, then you forget it, and it takes a lot of time to catch back up to the point where you were before.
Going back to data analysis, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you've encountered about data analysis and its role in business strategy?
The misconception, I think, is individuals who are not familiar with it, they believe that you can take your tool and you can apply the tool and you can find a solution too quickly. Like, by running your data one time, well, where's the result that's going to make me famous? Or where's the result that's going to enable me to complete the assignment? But in terms of data analysis, it's not one data analysis, it's a series of data analysis, because each time you take a look at it, there may be something that's slightly different from it, and what you have to do is to compile all the slightly different versions, or maybe even some versions that didn't work out at all that you thought would work out based upon the logic that you'd used, and that true data analysis is something that builds upon itself, and it takes you, instead of they're thinking that they can do it in an hour or a day or whatever, it's probably going to take them several days and maybe even several weeks when you have a large database like we have today. I mean, increasingly we have what's called big data, and some of these data sets are millions of data points. And when you have millions of data points, there are obviously a lot of different pathways in that data before you find the pathway which is the best pathway to reveal a meaningful pattern in the data that you can use to make decisions. So the idea of data analysis is, I have this technique and I'm going to apply it to the data and I'm immediately going to find a solution, is not really realistic. It's like persistence and dedication and thinking and talking to other people, because no individual can know all of the things. Even someone like myself who's been doing it, I have to do it multiple times to tease out of the data patterns what really are the essential components that help me to understand the relationships and ultimately make decisions based upon those patterns.
This has been a hot topic for the last year and a half, 2 years, but how do you see artificial intelligence and machine learning impacting the future of marketing research?
Well, artificial intelligence as a component of all data analysis and analytics is basically going to change it. And in fact, it's already changed it. And I'm now working on the next edition of the multivariate book. And also I'm working on the business analytics book, which is going to be a new one. And artificial intelligence is a component of analytics. So, for example, in my traditional multivariate book, what we did is we analyzed the data and wrote it up based upon us making the decisions in the software. So about a month or so ago, my colleagues, my co-authors and I, we took Genesis, which is one of the platforms, and we've also used ChatGPT, and we gave it the data and we gave it the information that we had previously input into the software, with us managing the software and making certain decisions. And we developed prompts and asked both of those different platforms to give us a solution and interpret the data. And AI was spot on in terms of interpretation of the data that we had manually or personally interpreted in terms of making recommendations. So what I would say is I view artificial intelligence as kind of like moving from small computers to big computers and faster computers. Is artificial intelligence is going to be something that, in fact, you can apply to it and we can become much more efficient. And I'll give you a specific example. There is and this is more of a qualitative or a combined qualitative and quantitative approach that historically we had to make decisions through, but it's called sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis is where you have information, and it could be board reports or it could be any kind of publication. And we used to physically set up the computer to identify words and phrases and organize that in terms of meaningful patterns. Well, today you can take ChatGPT or Genesis or one of those and say, here's the information, identify those patterns, and produce for me the common underlying patterns in that data. And it will produce something which is in essence a sentiment analysis, and you can use that in combination with your quantitative, and in essence, it's a balance of both quantitative and qualitative, and AI makes it faster and more efficient, and also more quickly identifies patterns that might take us a day to, in fact, get through the data, can quickly do it in, I would say, maybe an hour or less. So, summarize, artificial intelligence is going to make it faster and more efficient and more capable of understanding data, particularly these huge data sets we deal with today. So in the future, we're going to be able to do it quicker and more efficient, which means we can, in fact, have more data and more information. And as long as it's not so much information, we can't possibly put it together into patterns of making decisions. It will make it easier and faster and enable us to make better decisions.
So after all this, you've given us an advice about research, but what is one piece of advice you wish you learned earlier in your career? And what message would you share with students today?
Well, I would simply say that early in my career, I did not know all the tools that were capable of drilling down into the data and identifying patterns. And the one piece of advice that I would give students is that there, in essence, are a series of tools, and you mentioned machine learning, but there are a number of other tools. So the first thing that you need to know is you need to know what your data is, and then you need to know what tool will help you. And a combination of knowing the data and knowing the tool and apply, and I say one tool, there may be multiple tools, but basically the ability to tie together what your data is and how it can be analyzed to find the best solution and what tool is most effective is probably what I wish I I knew enough in the early years. Then I was just putting together the basic fundamentals, but today I'm at the point where I have a good feel for all the different tools and what they will do. And was a long journey for me. And what I would say is because of artificial intelligence and some other capabilities with tools we didn't have before, that time to absorb that and combine it and ultimately tease out the pearls of wisdom from the data is easier and quicker, but that's the way life is. You stay up to date, you look forward, and you learn new tools, and you become more efficient, and you enjoy it.
You enjoy it. A lot of students have to keep that in mind. Yeah. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Yeah. You're welcome.
That was our guest, Professor Joe Hare. My name is Klara Zuanic, and this was UNIDU Interview.